Chris Christie is the former Republican governor of New Jersey and the first major politician to stand behind Donald Trump amongst his defeated opponents and say, "I'm for him." He stood there like a Stepford wife, barely blinking, looking adoringly on the man he called his close friend, Donald. Well, time has passed and Chris Christie's changed his mind. He's in New Hampshire now, contemplating a presidential campaign, and he's the first Republican to say something startling out loud. No matter what, even if Donald Trump is the Republican nominee in 2024, Chris Christie will not support him. It seems the January 6th choir and Donald Trump standing there stoically with his hand over his heart, pledging allegiance, was the final straw. But the story of Chris Christie and Donald Trump is a long and entangled one, and we shouldn't forget it on the eve of Chris Christie's presidential campaign. We should look back on his record, his judgment, his character. Chris Christie was neck deep in it, all the way with the Trump clan, all the way through. And what separated Chris Christie from so many of the other cynics is that Chris Christie had better choices, and he chose not to make them. He threw it all away. This was a man who could have walked to the Republican nomination through a certain window in 2012, yet he demurred. He said he wasn't ready. And yet when it came to Donald Trump, every principle was discarded, every judgment. Chris Christie was a prosecutor who tolerated this lawlessness swirl all around him. Yet there is a truth about Chris Christie that we should consider in this moment. We're all works in progress, and there have been deeply, deeply, deeply flawed people in the American story that have risen to the occasion. And so here we are in 2023, and Chris Christie has laid out a proposition in the state of New Hampshire, saying and asserting something that's deeply true, that Donald Trump will not go gently into that good night, that whatever happens will be loud and messy. Now, Chris Christie helped build the monster. He fed at its edges, nibbling, trying to get everything that he could. He defended Donald Trump everywhere that there was a camera on, looking for someone to defend the indefensible. And he was rewarded for it as a commentator at ABC News, where he sits on a perch, holding forth, now in opposition to Donald Trump, while calculating if there's a lane for him to attain political power. It's not particularly noble, but it may be enormously useful, because the one thing that Donald Trump has been able to avoid is direct confrontation from a skillful opponent. And Chris Christie is nothing if not skillful. Very, very rarely will you see an instance in a political debate where an opponent does this to his foe. Chris Christie made a direct attack against Marco Rubio and in an instant emasculated him, defenestrated him.
I want the people at home to think about this. That's what Washington, D.C. does. The drive-by shot at the beginning with incorrect and incomplete information, and then the memorized 25-second speech that is exactly what his advisors gave him. See, Marco, the thing is this. When you're president of the United States, when you're a governor of a state, the memorized 30-second speech where you talk about how great America is at the end of it doesn't solve one problem for one person. They expect you to plow the snow. They expect you to get the schools open. And when the worst natural disaster in your state's history hits you, they expect you to rebuild their state, which is what I've done. None of that stuff happens on the floor of the United States Senate. It's a fine job. I'm glad you ran for it, but it does not prepare you for president of the United States.
Chris Christie is a talented man. There's no doubt about that. But he's utterly principleless. Chris Christie's a talented man. He can be funny, he can be charming. But in the end, he was one of Donald Trump's chief lieutenants. He got everything that he could get out of it And then he saw that he could get no more except by switching sides. Chris Christie wants to be the front man. Chris Christie is ready to call his old friend out because Chris Christie didn't like the January 6th choir. Well, I suppose we all have our red lines. Now, Chris Christie is utterly unfit for any position of public responsibility whatsoever. He demonstrated that with his dishonesty, his prevarications, his dissembling, his quibbling, and his absurdities over these last 8 years. The simple truth is, history might have bended in a different way had Chris Christie gone out instead of standing behind Donald Trump and said, "There's no way I could support this man. He's been my friend for 15 years. Let me tell you about him." He knew exactly who Donald Trump was, but he didn't care because he thought he could get something out of it, and he got a lot out of it. But now Chris Christie wants to be the leader of the Republican Party for the purposes of taking out Trump. Well, he may be useful then. But in the end, it's important to remember who Chris Christie is. Someone who's completely full of shit.